So our second session is actually getting more practical and applied about promoting and developing nature in cities and how we do that. And the chair of this session is one of my trustees, so she's definitely a good egg. But she's Professor Jane Memmott, who is head of the Ecology department at Bristol University.
Thank you, Bevis. Right, it's a delight to be here. Right, so I'm, as Bevis says, I'm a professor of ecology and I'm head of biological sciences at the university. I've got 5 minutes to introduce the topic of promoting and developing nature in cities. And I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to start off by just telling you 2 very short stories about what urban ecology means to me. I'm going to then go on to tell you about some of the fantastic achievements here in the city of Bristol, and many of which I've seen. Some amazing things are happening here on the doorstep. And then I'll introduce you to the panellists, and we've got 3 amazing panellists that'll take you through different aspects of this topic. So starting off with my first story, this is the second peregrine story of the day, okay? Peregrines are fantastic things, and I'm really a bug person, I'm an entomologist, but birds, they're a special bird. So most days, I walk into Bristol, I come over the suspension bridge and into Bristol, and one day I'm walking over there on my early morning walk to work, and I see this odd-looking thing flying to me, and I realise, as it gets closer, it's a peregrine carrying a pigeon. It gets closer and closer, and just as I think it's about to hit me, it swerves under the bridge, lands, and I peep over the edge, and there underneath is the female waiting for it, and there's 2 peregrines and a pigeon, a dead pigeon, just sat about 10 foot below me. And it was so amazing, I had to tell someone. So there's a man in a suit coming towards me. So I go over and I grab him. I was just so excited. And we just watched these 2 birds kind of having breakfast together. And that's what urban ecology is about. That's what urban nature is about. Those sorts of wow moments where it just puts a spring in your step. I smiled all day long. I just, it's just brilliant. That's one story. The second story is I've been leading a really big research project called the Urban Pollinators Project. It started about 5 years ago. We're just in the writing up stage. It involves 28 people, 12 cities, a whole bunch of academics and nature practitioners. We planted 60 meadows. We did a lot of science. But one day, I got into work, and there's probably the nicest email I've ever had. Okay, and I'm just going to read it to you. It's just a paragraph from a complete stranger. So I go into work, on my computer is this email. It says, "Hello, no query, just a quick email to thank you and your colleagues. I work in Castlemead Building, and one of the high points of my day this summer has been walking past your flower meadow in Castle Park, smelling and seeing all those blooms and all those happy insects bumbling back and forth between them. I really can't adequately express how much joy it's given me, or even explain why. Some of my colleagues, and presumably many, many other people. And presumably it's helped your research, and the insect populations too. I very much hope you can do it again next year, although you may wish to add some nettles or something thorny to prevent drunken festival goers tearing up the flowers next time. That was distressing." Okay, so that's the sort of thing, again, that this is Castlemead Building, if you're not from Bristol, is right in the middle of the city. And we put a flower meadow in there with the Bristol City Councils. So urban stuff is really important to lots and lots of people. It makes you happy, basically. So moving on to the second point, achievements. I'm just going to do a roll call of some of the amazing things that have been going on here in Bristol. There's the 1 tree per child policy. Bristol City Council have been running this. Every one of the 36,000 children in Bristol in 130 primary schools is planting at least 1 tree. So far, 10,000 trees have been planted since March 2014. Okay, look these things up on Google. There's all sorts of nice stories behind them. Bristol City Council again. There's 4 new local nature reserves designations, making 12 in total in Bristol. And then there's a whole bunch of amazing schemes running. There's the My Wild City scheme, which includes planting 20,000 flower plugs. 2015, what are they called? Wildlife garden starter kits out there. This is the Avon Wildlife Trust, the University and Bristol City Council. There's the My Wild Cathedral, 150 churches in Bristol, a collaboration between Bristol City Cathedral and the Avon Wildlife Trust. There's the Wild School and the My Wild Street. But just about everything in Bristol right now, there's a wild alternative to it. So Google these things. They are fantastic. Okay, the My Wild Street thing is amazing. And this is all part of a plan for a citywide nature reserve. These activities, they focus on engagement. They're about getting people involved. And to me, urban stuff, it's a win-win situation. It's good for biodiversity and it's good for people. But these are the questions we're going to be answering in this panel session. Are we doing enough? Are we doing it right? What can we learn from other cities? I'm a big fan of ideas to steal. Okay, what are other people doing better than Bristol? And this is a good time to introduce the panelists. We've got 3 fantastic panelists. The first one is David Goode, and just let me tell you about David Goode. He's got 40 years' experience as an ecologist and naturalist, working in both central and local government in the UK, and an international reputation for working on environmental projects. And these range from wetland conservations to urban sustainability. He published Wild in London in 1986, co-edited the Routledge book of the Handbook of Urban Ecology in 2011, and his most recent book, Nature in Towns and Cities, published in 2014, is there too. And he's worked all over the world. He's got major cities in China and in Santiago in Chile. He's a visiting professor at University College London since 1994, an honorary professor at East China Normal University for a number of years as well. So, with no further ado, let me introduce David Goode. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go through the questions that we've been set. And the first one is nature in safe hands? Well, there are many hands, as we've heard this morning. I'd just like to run through. There's a kind of spectrum of activity. Some are devoted specifically to wildlife conservation, and I imagine a lot of people in this room are working with wildlife trusts, and you are directly involved, and it is your major aim in life to do nature conservation. And there are the managers of local nature reserves, and there are the managers of places like Camley Street Natural Park, all sorts of natural parks and places around in towns and cities. There are other people who have a wider range of interests, like National Trust, Royal Parks in London, City Corporation in London is a big one, and then places like cemetery trusts, who have a very specific job to look after the historic side of an ancient cemetery, a 1830s cemetery, like the one famous one in Bristol, which these are people who have other aims in life, but nature conservation becomes a major part of their enterprise. And there are large areas of public open space managed by local authorities, which are of great wildlife value. We have agencies like Railtrack, Canal and Rivers Trust, all the Thames docks people, or all manner of people who get involved, but in varying degrees. And probably the biggest category in terms of area is private landowners, private householders with gardens, because those gardens cover huge areas of towns and cities. A fifth of Greater London is private gardens. So effectively, we know what there is, and we also know the people who are involved in managing them. And the issue that we're faced with is, how can we ensure that nature is in safe hands? Well, there are linkages that go on. Nature improvement areas is a new way of working together across a whole range of different bodies to extend the philosophy and to make things work. And certainly the natural capital debate that we've heard this morning is interesting. It encourages linkages, but it raises its own philosophical problems. Now, I'll put myself on the line. I'm committed to an approach involving planning, and I started doing this in London in the early 80s. I had worked with the Nature Conservancy, so I was imbued with the idea of protecting sites, such as SSSIs, but I was dealing with it on a local level in London with a different philosophy where it mattered to people rather than being based on a solely scientific approach. And in that strategic planning approach, we identified 1,500 sites of importance for nature conservation, which then became notified in each of the borough plans. And then in 2000, when Ken Livingstone, this started with the GLC in the early 80s, and Ken Livingstone went off into the wilderness for a few years, but then he came back as mayor of London, and he then adopted the system that we'd been using in London for designation of all the sinks, as we called them. Now, 1500 is a good area of London. It's something getting on for 20%. And I gather there are nearly 100 such sites in Bristol. And they cover all kinds of habitat, including encapsulated countryside, reservoirs, cemeteries, brownfield land, and many other kinds. You know the story. And the fact that they've been identified in London has been very successful. It was a good system, and for many years they were, with a few exceptions, safe from development. There will be people who will dispute this, but I think it was remarkably successful from the 1980s until the early 2000s. Times are now changing, and things are being lost, and there are changes in attitude. I'll come back to the issues to do with protection of sites. The second question we were posed was, how should we promote more involvement of people? Obviously, the Wildlife Trust have a huge role to play, but I would like to just mention the natural history societies, who've been in existence for a long time, since the mid-1800s. Do you know there was one particular excursion from Manchester in 1860, which had a series of trains booked for the people going on it, and there were 550 people went on a nature trip out of Manchester, out to the Wirral Peninsula. 550 people is inconceivable nowadays to be doing that sort of thing. But that's what happened. And we have this absolutely huge legacy of information about towns and cities as a result of the natural history societies. And people like John Kieran, who wrote The Natural History of New York, actually drew on exactly the same thing there, and certainly Richard Fitter did in Britain with his London's Natural History later on, in 1945. These are all amateurs producing atlases. We are all familiar with these, I'm sure, the bird atlases, plant dragonflies and butterflies and so on. But they are absolutely crucial as the baseline for much of what we do. The one in the West Midlands, the new Flora for the West Midlands, is an absolutely brilliant example of how the collection of data by amateurs can result in a greater understanding of urban ecology. Read it. It's absolutely amazing to look at the way the plants are used to designate the different squares in Birmingham. It's an exquisite example of understanding urban ecology. There are new approaches now with bio-blitzes. I was involved with one in a small cemetery in Bath where we found over 100 species of lichen in a very few days of work, which was excellent. There are local neighbourhood wildlife watch groups. Rather than neighbourhood watch, we have neighbourhood wildlife watch. And these people are now getting together and going and looking at their local wildlife. They could be schools, or residents' associations, or care homes. All kinds of people are getting involved in that kind of involvement with their local area. I suspect Georgia will have more to say about this from her work. I run wildlife walks in Bath, where I live, and they're extremely popular. People are always phoning up and saying, can you do a walk? And I've reached the stage now where, well, they're very popular for the walks. Dawn choruses in May at 4:30 aren't quite so popular, but there are people who turn up, and they are a real stalwart bunch who come at 4:30, and we have a fantastic time. I'm now developing an app for my local, effectively it's a parish of Widcombe on the south side of Bath, which goes right from the river in the middle out into the sort of rural end of Bath in the south side. And people are getting very excited by the prospect of carrying either a tablet or a cell phone and being able to get an app that tells them different places within the parish where they can see wildlife. I don't have to go. It'll be great. And the kids love it. I think the smartphone is the new butterfly net. It's working as a means of identifying things. The iSpot system that's been developed by the Open University is an astonishing thing. And it means that you can take a photograph on your cell phone, you can send it to the website, and within minutes, quite often, you'll get some expert in a natural history society or in a wildlife trust coming back to you and saying, oh, that's a brimstone butterfly or whatever. And the kids absolutely adore this because they're getting an immediate reaction. It's a new kind of society that they're involved with, different from natural history as it used to be, but probably very significant. I think the internet is providing some of the answers rather than some of the problems. I think certainly children are getting hooked on that kind of approach. I had a young lad the other day came to my garden, and he was 8 years old. He was the grandson of a friend, and I didn't know him at all. But I said, would you like to go and see my spiders? And I was waiting to see what sort of reaction. He said, yeah, what are they? What sort? And I said, well, they live in tubes. They're called a tube web spider. He said, gosh, are they called Segestria? 8-year-old kid. I thought, my goodness. And he got very excited when I said, yes, they're Segestria. And I got a ladder, and he climbed up the ladder, and I caught a fly in my house with a pair of tweezers, took it out, put it on the little strands that come out from the tube, and out came this great spider. And this lad's face was a picture. He said, God, I saw its green jaws. You know, absolutely fantastic. He was really hooked on, he's going to be an arachnologist, obviously. I think my peregrine story for today is a lady. I go down to the river in Bath and I watch the peregrines, and I say to people, have a telescope there, and I say, do you want to see a peregrine falcon? And they sort of look at me and say, yes, where? And I say, look down there. And when they look through, they all say, wow. And that's the moment of truth for them, because they see this great big face of a peregrine filling the screen of the telescope. And one lady said, you know, we had kestrels on our window box in London, on our windowsill in London. I said, gosh, that was amazing. Yes, they had 4 young, and we saw them right through the season. We had this amazing windowsill. And they turned out to be living in the Tower of London. She was the wife of a beefeater. And I thought it's astonishing. Now, quickly, what are the main constraints? The population growth that's been mentioned is enormous. The UK population is growing rapidly. London's population is predicted to grow from 8.6 to 11 million by 2050. And we're all going to be faced with this. We're going to need new schools, housing, hospitals, business parks. Everything there is huge pressure and huge political pressure for development. We've already heard a lot about this. There are government policies giving priority for development on brownfield land, which poses problems in 2 ways, because there are specialist features of brownfield land ecologically which need to be accommodated and which we're going to be losing. And also, they are very often the few open spaces in already heavily built up areas. So people are going to lose out irrespective of the biodiversity. I think climate change has diverted attention from biodiversity across the board, not just cities. But the importance of green infrastructure to combat negative effects of climate change is now being appreciated, and that could well be a factor in our favour. I mean, biodiversity may have an ally, even despite the arguments that we've had this morning. And there are problems with education. The policies that prevent direct contact with nature pose serious problems. The loss of ecological expertise in decision-making is a final issue. Now, I'd just like to come on to a few points on how we overcome these factors. I think we need to reverse the loss of ecological expertise in local authorities. And one suggestion I would make is to go back to my roots and have multidisciplinary teams, and whether they're wildlife trusts or what, we need to get these people working for local authorities on a collaborative basis so that it's value for money. We need to get the economic value of ecological services voiced with conviction at all levels of government. And I would say, if Camley Street's worth 2.8 million, what's the value of London's green infrastructure in total? It must be billions, if not trillions. We need to encourage, I would just suggest this one, it's a very simple one, encourage town and city dwellers to manage their own gardens. We know that an awful lot is being done. But we can also argue for completely new towns designing in habitats for wildlife. We'll hear more about that this afternoon, I'm sure. So those are some of the things. I would add to that, we need a new philosophy. We need a huge shift in philosophy. And the idea of a national park city for London, London becoming a national park city, if you haven't heard about that, it's a great idea. It sounds crazy, but in fact, there is a huge value because it would shift the balance. It would respect the natural world alongside city living. And I would just end by saying, Naomi Klein says we need a shift on the scale of the abolition of slavery to deal with climate change. We need something on that scale to deal with biodiversity conservation too. Thank you very much.
I'd like to introduce our next panellist. Georgia Stokes is the Chief Executive of the Birmingham and Black Country Wildlife Trust. She joined the Trust from the Northfield Eco Centre, which she led for 6 years, bringing projects such as the Cycle South Brum and the Urban Harvest to fruition. Okay, so Georgia, where are you? I can't see you there. I've got the lights in my eyes. Come on up. So 10 minutes from Georgia.
Thank you very much, everybody. I should start with a confession, which is to say that I think on this particular panel, I'm the only non-ecologist. So I do have the privilege of working with fantastic ecologists. I will try and do their position justice today, but bring a slightly different perspective, perhaps. So obviously, Birmingham and the Black Country, we are a wholly urban area. We cover Wolverhampton, Dudley, Walsall, Sandwell, and Birmingham. You've heard quite a bit about today. We have a small bit of green belt, but in general, it's all not just urban, but it's based on industrial heritage, and whatever environment we have is generally man-made anyway. But that doesn't mean to say, as you've heard this morning, we don't have any wildlife. We have a lot, very rich areas of wildlife. When I was talking about coming down here today and thinking about what I would say, I asked my reserves officers for some ideas. And one of them told me that he recently watched an episode of Spring Watch, and the programme travelled to 3 different, very rural, very beautiful parts of the UK to study the 3 species in that show, which were peregrine falcons, so your 5th peregrine falcon story today, water voles and badgers. He said, I can go out in my garden in Birmingham and I can see all of those. I don't have to go anywhere. And I thought that's quite a poignant story. We need to remember that, actually, because we have a huge amount of rich variety within our cities and our urban areas. And I wanted to talk just a little bit about one of our newest sites, which is Deersleep Woods, which is right on the cusp of Birmingham and Sandwell. It's a small site. It's 4.5 acres. But there recently we've seen herons, kingfishers, badgers, newts, all sorts of pollinators, woodpeckers, 2 different types. The approach that we're taking with that site, because it's got a huge amount of heritage, it's had a friends group that saved it from being built over before, they've worked there for 30 years, and it's been part of the Mitchell and Butler's brewery. So actually, if you remember, Mitchell and Butler's had a deer leaping as part of their logo. That's because of Deersleep Wood. It's now, the brewery site has been developed into housing, and it's called Deersleep Housing Estate. So the site itself is really important to the local community. The Friends group is still working there, they're working with us, but the residents of the new housing estate are also getting more and more involved. It's a collaborative approach as well, because in the contract that we took on the site, the City Council are stakeholders, but Severn Trent Water are also stakeholders because of sewage works that go underneath the site and because of a brook that goes across the site. So it's a partnership project to make that site much better for wildlife, to make it safer, and to get the people involved. So to think about the question that David first mentioned about whether nature is in safe hands, I think that Dearsley Wood is in safe hands because it's in many pairs of hands, which is the theme that I think is coming out from previous discussions this morning. That kind of collaborative approach is how the Wildlife Trust for Birmingham and the Black Country developed the nature improvement area. Now, I can't claim any credit for that because I wasn't there. But what they've done, what they did when they put the bid into DEFRA, for those of you who are not aware of nature improvement areas, I'm sure most of you are, but they came out of a white paper in 2011, and there were 12 funded nature improvement areas by DEFRA for 3 years. Ours is the only urban nature improvement area. The rest are much more rural, and they take a landscape approach to nature conservation. And they work on we developed ours, and other, they all work along the same principles, the Lawton principles of more and better core ecological sites and more joined up. So we're talking about corridors, migration routes. Our nature improvement area involved over 60 organisations, and they are organisations from the small friends groups that may have been 5 or 6 people to all the local authorities, to some private sector organisations, Wildlife Trust, Canal and Rivers Trust, and many, many others. I won't mention them all. But it was very much a shared approach, a shared strategy to develop nature conservation across the whole of Birmingham and the Black Country along 6 key themes, which were woodland, grassland, heathland, wetland, geology, and people. Because we're an urban area. If we don't involve people, we're not going to make any progress at all. What we've done so far in the first 3 years of DEFRA-funded nature improvement area, we've involved over 2,000 volunteers, 90 different groups. We have created 67 hectares, or enhanced 67 hectares of grassland, so wildflower meadows. We've done a lot of that. We've improved 90 hectares of woodland and enhanced 3 hectares of heathland and created 10 kilometres of corridor habitat as well, so working with Canal and Rivers Trust, for example. The methodology for the strategy for the approach, David has already kind of preempted by mentioning the Flora of Birmingham and the Black Country. It came from that collaborative work, which was mainly done by volunteers. It took about 10 years, I believe, for them to collect all the data to actually measure the axiophyte presence in each kilometre square of Birmingham and the Black Country, which is a huge, huge undertaking. Brilliant. That's exactly what we want, isn't it? Nature in our city. So that methodology informed the strategy. And through that, what we did was identify our core ecological areas, our linking areas, and we do have a map. We were asked not to bring slides today, otherwise I would have shown it to you, but I have got a paper copy if you want to see. There is a huge area that goes right across the middle of Birmingham and the Black Country where there is very little green space at all. And that is our biggest challenge, is to, obviously we need to protect the green spaces that we do have, but how are we going to get nature into those key areas? The other interesting part of that mapping exercise is that we overlaid it on indices of multiple deprivation. And it may come as no surprise to any of you to learn that the areas where there's no green space or very little green space are also the highest deprived areas in Birmingham and the Black Country. So we have an ecological imperative to act, but also a social one as well, which I think we're probably all aware of, but for me it was quite stark to see it on that map. Nature improvement areas were funded for 3 years. Our funding from DEFRA ran out in March this year, but we've been successful in gaining Esme Fairbairn Foundation funding to continue for 3 years, which is fantastic. The focus of both nature improvement area funding bids was about people, as I said. So how have we done that, and what are we planning to do, I guess is what you're all wondering. We are working with people on their sites. So we're not trying to take over the sites. We're not saying the Wildlife Trust is going to manage these sites. This is about going to the sites that people already care about and working with them to make sure that they have the skills to manage those sites for nature into the future. So we've developed a number of key projects. The first one is called FIN, the Freshwater Invertebrate Network project. We have a lot of canals and a lot of waterways that go through Birmingham and the Black Country. What we've done is train up the groups, existing groups, so they might be friends groups, they might be residents groups, they might be just a group that has a particular affinity, a natural history group, a geology group. We train them up to be able to monitor the invertebrates present in the watercourses, and through that to identify whether there are any misconnections and report them to the Environment Agency. They have identified one major pollution incident, and we've managed to, through the Environment Agency, get the polluter to pay for restoration. So that's actually paid for everything that we've spent on Finn so far, which just shows in a couple of years it can have a really positive impact. We also do that, we have an Eyes on the Ground project, so we train groups to recognise indicator species for meadows and for woodland, so they can monitor the health of those. And we have a Growing Local Flora project, which is about getting volunteers out collecting seeds of yellow rattle, those kinds of seeds, propagating them in Eco Park in one of our sites in Smallheath in Birmingham, and then planting them out as a woodland flora layer to encourage that growth in the woodlands that we're enhancing. So those have been successful and continue. But for us, the nature improvement area isn't simply about a funded project. It's actually a strategy and it's a vision for the whole of our region. And we are taking that strategy out and getting it to be agreed currently by the local authorities, by the local nature partnership. Birmingham has a Green Commission, which is sort of morphing into the West Midlands Combined Authority Green Commission, and we're working on having it adopted and accepted as a spatial strategy for the whole region. So it's not just going to be dependent on funding, and we hope that through that kind of mapping exercise that we can, as a region, make the best use of the resources that we know are going to be diminishing. That's an inevitability. So, yes, we have challenges. We have 100,000 new houses that are going to be built in Birmingham in the next 20 years, a population of 2 million and growing, and budget cuts. We're waiting on Birmingham's budget with bated breath at the moment. And the disconnect of children from nature. I just wanted to share one statistic with you today, which is on the longest day of the year this year, 1 in 14 children spent less than a minute outdoors, which I think is quite a stark reality for us to remember. On Monday, we had an event at our Eco Park, which is a similar site to Camley Street, with Nick Baker. We brought schools down, and we had children there who said, "I've never seen a frog." They were looking at woodlice through microscopes with equal degrees of amazement and fear, I think, is the only word to describe some of them when they saw these creatures up close. But it was absolutely wonderful to get these kids who, in inner city Birmingham, their teachers were saying they don't have any habitat on the playgrounds because there is no room for the children, let alone for any kind of green space to be incorporated into school sites. So it really is imperative that we continue to do more of what we are doing. And I'm sure that there's more I could say, but I'm sure I can bring that into the panel debate. But I think if we want to continue to do the positive work that we do and to make an even bigger impact, it is about having many pairs of safe hands and bringing more and more people into that kind of partnership.
Thank you, and perfect timing there. Right, third and final speaker for this morning. We've got Mathew Frith. He's Director of Policy and Planning at the London Wildlife Trust, urban ecologist with 25 years experience of land management policy and practice in nature conservation. He's managed nature reserves and developed policies to advocate the protection and creation of green infrastructure. And he's going to be talking for 10 minutes. Again, I can't see you. There you are. You've got the lights in your eyes up here. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. Just before I start, it'd be interesting to know who I'm actually speaking to. So how many of you are in the broad camp of developers, house builders, planners, architects? 1, 2, a minority. And who of you are kind of nature activists? You do this for your day job. Interesting. Okay. A little bit about London Wildlife Trust. We are one of the 5 wildlife trusts that emerged in urban areas at the cusp of the 1970s and 1980s. Formed in 1981 in Stoke Newington Secondary School, 400 people turned up to eat carrot cake sticky buns and learn about the ecology of rubbish tips. Because the perception then from the nature conservation organisations, the government agencies, the big NGOs, was that there was no nature in our cities, and we know how wrong they were. We tried to plant a primrose on Primrose Hill as part of our declaration of what we wanted for London. The Department of Environment, who managed Primrose Hill, refused permission to plant a primrose at Primrose Hill. Thankfully, the Royal Parks, who now manage Primrose Hill, are doing a lot of good work in acid grass and restoration. We campaigned to save sites, such as Sydenham Hill Wood, Gunnersbury Triangle, and you've heard much of Camley Street Natural Park today, which we manage. We went on to further try and save Camley Street, which we were successful in HS1, High Speed 1, which was going to come up through the middle of it in the end of the 1980s. So Chris was absolutely right. It's remarkable that it is still there and forming a critical part of the amazing transformation at King's Cross today. We mapped the city in 1984 and 85, working to David and Ken Livingstone to provide us with the sinks that we enjoy, 1,574 in fact, that we now have in London, forming 19% of the Greater London area. We established nature reserves, which are mainly managed by volunteers, so this is not news to any of you. And we've undertaken a huge amount of citizen science, so utilising the natural interest of people, their own expertise, their own motivations to tell us what they see in the city and why it's important to them. So we have a brilliant map of stag beetles in London now, national hotspot, and we're now starting this work on deer because deer are beginning to make their presence known further and further into the city. And we promoted wildlife in gardens. We established the Green Space Information for Greater London, which is the Environmental Records Centre, which has 3 million records on its system. And from that, we know that London hosts at least 13,000 species. So the idea that there is no nature in London has been proven categorically wrong, and we are probably arguably the most biodiverse region in the UK. But fundamentally, we're about bringing people closer to nature. So this disconnection that George talked about, absolutely critical to our work. And one project which we're undertaking at Camley Street, for example, is called New Routes. It's working with ex-offenders, it's working with prisoners, it's working with people with alcohol addiction problems, and about their rehabilitation into the world, to give them confidence, to give them skills. And we're up for an award for the Howard League of Penal Reform in that kind of work. So it's the kind of cutting-edge stuff that we think we're doing as part of the broader social benefits for people living in a place like London. But most of this work that we set up in the 1980s was in London was going into a period of economic decline. It dropped from 6.6 million in 1980 to 6.1 million in 1988. Of course, since that period of time, it is now 8.6 million. So it is now higher than it was in 1939. And it's set to grow to 10 million by 2030. How on earth are we going to accommodate those new houses, those new homes, if London is not to grow outwards, given our concerns about Greenbelt, and we don't like living above 5 floors. So there are huge pressures on the sites, the sinks that David talked about. We've just published this called Space is Wild. It's trying to promote the multifunctional benefits of our wildlife sites, because most of those are actually parks. And how do we address the disconnection that Georgia talked about, which is fundamentally a critical element of particularly the younger generations who are increasingly internalised in their worlds. So I've been asked to sort of give 5 things that we would do in order to try and meet these challenges. First and foremost, and it was part of the discussion this morning, was about we are having to work with developers. That is a big kind of issue for many of our members. The idea is that they are the big bad guys, we should keep them afar, that we should not taint our pure selves by working with such beasts. But if we don't work with them, we will never change them. And we're working with a project up at Stoke Newington called Woodbury Wetlands. It's with Berkeley Homes, it's with Thames Water, it's with Hackney Council. Berkeley Homes are regenerating Woodbury Down Estate, described as utopia in 1956. And they're transforming that from 1,900 homes to 5,300 homes by 2031. Right by a reservoir which has been publicly inaccessible since 1833. And we're working to improve the reservoir for wildlife, to make that reservoir accessible to the new residents of Woodbury Down, and to make it a destination for people to work, to enjoy nature close into the heart of the city. But we've also influenced Berkeley Homes in the landscaping of the new regeneration. So the landscaping is much more biodiversity friendly, there's much more green roofs and, dare I say it, green infrastructure to make those connections between the estate and the reservoirs. We're doing similar work up at West Hendon, another big regeneration programme just on the edges of the Brent Reservoir. I spent 7 years working for Peabody, a big social landlord in London, and critically, they are major players. Social landlords are major players, particularly in terms of their residents. 24% of households in London are under social housing, 18% nationally. And we know that they have disproportionate numbers of people who are over 65, under 16, on low incomes, or from black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. The issue of environmental injustice is focused in such spaces and places where there's not much good quality natural green space. So we've been working with a whole number of social landlords on projects like Cockney Sparrow, natural estates, which for those of you who are coming to this afternoon, I'll tell you a little bit more about how we improve those open spaces, those dog shit deserts and the concrete jungles of our inner city urban neighbourhoods. We also need to have big, bold demonstration projects. I'm not a great fan of Grand Projets because they tend to be promoted by men. Nevertheless, we do need to show what can be done at a landscape scale. How do we translate the living landscapes or the futurescapes ideas of landscape scale conservation in an urban context? It's difficult because those connections are very difficult to make physically. So we are working on a project with Thames Water and the London Borough of Waltham Forest to establish Walthamstow wetlands at 211 hectares. It will be the biggest urban wetland project in Europe. Also working how to maintain that with, or to encourage that with communities that didn't even know these wetlands actually existed. They're actually almost invisible to see if you're travelling by car or by bus. So it's about trying to bring these connections together in places which have been generally ignored by the nature conservation organisations. The last two things are probably things more closely to my heart. One is about the media. We are very familiar that the media either sentimentalises nature or sows fear about the natural world. 2 schools in Tower Hamlets closed last week because there were some spiders in the roofs of those schools. What message is that sending to our children? That they are frightened of small invertebrates. So not the boy that was wowed by the green mandibles of a species I can't describe, but it's setting this fear, it's enhancing that disconnection. So there's an issue about the media. We need to be working much more cleverly with the media to get those messages right, linked to well-being, linked to this passion that so many people really do have for nature, but they're very rarely asked. And then that comes almost to the other issue, which is linked to that, which is language. I've been working in this field for many, many years, and the language we use is unbelievably complicated. It is unhelpful to most people. It is full of jargon and acronyms. We often don't speak with the same voice on issues which to most people are the same things. You know, if somebody says to me, I want to do something for wildlife, what do I do? Well, if you ask an ornithologist, they'll give you a different answer to an entomologist or a botanist. And we lose track of what actually most people are wanting. So I think we need to be careful about the language you use. I'm not a fan of ecosystem services, green infrastructure as terminology, but we need to use the right words for the right audiences. And fundamentally, I think it's about not losing sight of the love of nature, which Melissa talked about this morning, the beauty of nature, and how that enriches our collective lives. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank our 3 speakers for 3 really inspirational talks. And we've got half an hour to have a jolly good discussion.
I'm Difesa, I'm a wildlife cinematographer in Holland. And if I look at my age group, or a little bit younger than me, between 16 and 30 years, like the future planners of cities, like the future people who are really getting into it, they have little knowledge and little interest often in nature. So I think it's kind of challenging to reach those people in order to get them interesting. And for me, I'm trying to do that with Dutch festivals, actually, music festivals. So I'm going to implicate art and Dutch wildlife and education an interesting thing in those kind of places. So I think also for nature conservation, it's quite challenging to reach those audience, maybe even in nightclubs or with VJs or something like that. I think that can be really can be a change. But you don't really see wildlife communication towards that target group. But it can be quite important for the future of wildlife planning.
Okay, Georgia.
I don't have necessarily the answers, but just a perspective to share. I think what Mathew was saying about speaking the right language to the right audience, we need to be talking to younger people in the right way, and we need to be appealing to their interests. So, for instance, in Birmingham and the Black Country, there's quite a lot of arts-based projects that are now being developed that will be about green space and be set in natural space, but they're not about nature. I think those kinds of projects that can get people involved through other means, but the outcome for us is that they are actually going out into green spaces and finding out about the wonders of nature is one way of doing it. Obviously, the Every Child Wild kind of campaign that's being launched by the Wildlife Trusts will help to get children as they're younger, so we hope that they will grow up with that kind of interest, but that's not going to help the younger people of today. But it's finding things that people are interested in.
Okay, and
I mean, I think it is a real challenge. I mean, we're undertaking a piece of work at the moment in West London with 18, 17, 19-year-olds, and trying to get really an understanding of where their values are on this kind of stuff, where their understanding is. Because I remember I went to speak to a school of 16-year-olds many years back, trying to tell them basically what I did, and they looked at me as if I was stupid. Why on earth would you want to do that kind of work? I want to become a lawyer. I want to become a doctor. I want to earn a lot of money. And the idea that you were working consciously in a low-paid job, doing stuff where you get dirty and cold, is absolutely something they couldn't potentially understand. So I think there is a huge mountain to climb in this. And I think the other question is being aware of our own experiences, because between the ages of maybe 9, 10, 11 and whenever it was that I suddenly turned on again by nature, I wasn't interested in it either. So something clicked back again. And so sometimes I wonder whether we spend too much time trying to reach to a set of audience that is actually quite resistant to that.
Thank you. My name's Sue Thomas. I write about these things. And I wanted to bring up, I liked David's comment that the smartphone is the new butterfly net. And I want to say something in defence of technology and its kind of role in all of this. We were hearing some good stories from you about the peregrine and so on. And I have a story about my grandson who, when I was on the beach with him when he was 8, suddenly grabbed a stone and said, "This is a flint." And I said, "How do you know it's a flint?" And he said, "Minecraft, of course." And then the afternoon, this is in Bournemouth, we went to Hengistbury Head Visitor Centre, and he grabbed his flint from his pocket and thrust it at the first person he saw and said, "Is this a flint?" He was completely engaged through Minecraft. I can give you lots of other examples, but I want to be sure that we don't dismiss things like that simply because we don't play Minecraft, we don't understand it, and therefore we seeing a child with its head bent over a computer is a bad thing. It's often not a bad thing. I wonder if the panel has any comments on that.
Perhaps I didn't really hit the punchline with the young lad with the spider, but when I asked him how he knew about them, it was from the internet. And he was so excited to actually see it in reality. One of the problems I find with children and with schools is that it's very often the teachers don't know about nature, and basically they're scared about things they don't know about because it puts them in a difficult position. And so if I take a party of children to watch the peregrines, I will have a kind of little statement about what we're going to do for the teacher to put them at ease, and if they get any question, they pass the question to me. But there is a real difficulty in that sort of level of education, even at primary level, of actually convincing the teachers about the value of nature I think it's something that we've been really having problems with for a very long time.
I think it's critical. I think we cannot ignore the power of new technologies. I attended a conference about 2 months ago called Making London Nature Smart, and it was all about the work that some of the universities like Imperial and University College London are doing in developing new apps and technological means to help, say, record air quality, to give the kind of data collection easily applicable to ordinary people using their smartphones. And I think the issue is as much to do with the kind of organisational structures of organisations like us. You know, I don't understand it. That's my problem. But we shouldn't be depending on people of my age to work this out. We should be actually working with teenagers and young adults on how those technologies can shape the work that we do. Because if trying to blame, as you say, to blame technologies for the disconnection, there's a much wider systemic issue there. Those technologies can be really powerful for our cause.
I just wanted to pick up on one of the issues which is kind of in the background here, which is intergenerational communication. David is a kind of proxy grandfather obviously for lots of kids in Bath. There's a real grandmother over there. But actually, one of the reasons that those sunflowers didn't get trashed in Brixton actually was not because the little kids who planted them protected them, but because anybody who damaged them would have been crucified by their big brothers and sisters who were actually out there trashing the place at the same time. It was very clear that that kind of ownership relationship was very important to them. And very often, actually, if you are trying to engage with the older teenage sector, their Achilles heel very often is their grandparents, actually. And that's often used negatively. What would your grandma think about this kind of thing? But actually, in this context, this business of the middle generation being completely has lost touch and doesn't have the confidence is a really important factor. And it may be that actually we need to be much more proactive about linking the very young and the much older. And of course, that then is made difficult by the dysfunctional nature of our society. And, you know, my mother lives 3 hours away from me. So the Wildlife Trusts maybe need to have a kind of proxy grandparent operation running so that we can really feed between the generations. And the technological element is the payback element that disaffected middle generation can provide in that mix. Is the thing, as you've just said, that they know about, that they could teach the older people and the much younger people whilst they're learning from each of them.
Yeah, there's some powerful ideas there, David.
Can I just elaborate on the idea that I've been following in Bath to develop an app? This may be happening in other places, and I don't really know enough about what's going on in the industry. But I'm working with the person who does the tourist app for Bath. Bath has Georgian and Roman, and that's the great thing. And people come to Bath because they want to know about it. So there is an app that you can use, and you go around the city and you identify various places. And they've even got little things stuck in the wall which go bleep on your machine to tell you you're in a place where you go and listen to your machine. And so there is a real value in that. But what I'm now trying to talk through with them is how we can get the level for the children to actually get that kind of thing very much at their local level around where they live. So we're pioneering that one in one of the parishes. And I think that could be really quite instrumental because the teachers will use it as well, and they will begin to realise there is a huge body of information there which will work. So I'm totally with you on the value of of using the technology.
Hi, my name's Rab Bennett. I'm an architect from Bennett's Associates, but I'm also on the board of the Design Council, and I just wanted to make a point about something David said about getting multidisciplinary advice into local authorities, which obviously is really difficult at the moment. You can't just suddenly employ a whole load of people on full salaries and all the rest of it. Now, the Design Council now includes CABE, Commission for Architecture and Built Environment, and they are offering services to local authorities to do exactly that on a small cost basis. So they do, for example, design reviews for the whole of Oxford or Greenwich or possibly Birmingham and other places too. Now, there's a panel of 400 experts you can call on, including architects, of course, planners, transport landscape people, and people who have precisely the kind of knowledge you're talking about in this field. So if you're in the local authority world, you might just ring up CABE and get a bit of a quote and find out how much advice is available for very low cost. That was just a naked plug. I'm sorry about that, but there we go.
Well, I think we should promulgate that with all the local authorities, basically, because it is a very urgent issue, because a lot of local authorities have already lost their ecologists, and they're not likely with the present cuts to be re-employing ecologists. So there must be another mechanism that we're going to find that's cheaper.
Just a little comment on that one, actually. It's interesting working on urban flower meadows, because sometimes, again, a win-win situation when you've got no money, there's less money around for mowing. If you mow less, it can actually be good for the biodiversity. So there's occasional win-win things come out of processions. Not many, but just the odd one or two. So.
Hi, Justin Millwood from the Woodland Trust. There's a question about developing nature in cities. As one of the issues that comes up again and again when trying to create more green space is who's going to look after it in the long run, who's going to pay for it. Obviously that's exacerbated at the moment with the budgetary climate. Do you have any solutions to that issue which gets thrown at us so often as to what's going to happen in the long term?
No solutions exactly, but it's I think, back to what I was saying, really, it's about a collaborative approach and having more and more people involved and making sure that the people have the skills to do that. So the kind of training for the volunteer groups, the friends groups, and having, I mean, some of the things I wanted to say that didn't have the time to sort of develop, but bringing in new players, bringing in new stakeholders as well, so that there's a greater mandate to continue managing these spaces. So looking at public health, looking at skills and education, expanding those partnerships. But other than that, no, I don't have a solution today.
The Milton Keynes model is quite an interesting one. When they built Milton Keynes New Town, there was a large amount of money put in a pot for the management of all the green space in that place, in perpetuity. And it's not dependent on the rateable values or the income from people every year. It's based on the investment that they make with the original legacy that was made by the government in setting up Milton Keynes New Town. That could be applied, if we're talking about new towns to take this big increase in population. I would have thought that kind of model is what we need for ensuring that we do get green spaces with wildlife and that they are looked after in the long term. So it's one that's worth bearing in mind. Doesn't help us with existing places in terms of legacies, but I think it is a good model.
Do you know why it didn't catch on? I mean, Milton Keynes was built quite a long time ago.
Yeah, indeed. I don't know.
Maybe it just needs the right time and the right environment. So,
but, you know, they have a colossal amount of money. And they can manage that big area of green space that they have, including some key ancient woodlands, and also, I mean, it's every level of value in the town.
And that's not a dissimilar model to most social landlords, where the open space is managed through service charges. You know, so those models are there. The issue with social housing, in the sense, is that there has been a kind of a dumbed-down approach to space management, partly based on fear, partly based on the fact that it has no value, has no asset value, so therefore let's just keep it clipped to absolute starvation, so to speak. And that's where we're trying to sort of influence that, but there is a basis that the service charges are based on people with low income, so there's a number of tensions and conflicts there. We're working with another model which I know has been tried for the last sort of 10 years, which is what was the Land Restoration Trust, now the Land Trust, set up through English Partnerships and others in 2002 or something like that. So we're managing a site for them, which came through an endowment, which was originally going to come to us, but because of various issues. So there is an endowment through a Section 106 agreement. Those Section 106 agreements may be moving much more towards community infrastructure levy. Nevertheless, those are things that we could be looking at in terms of funding models. Dare I put into the fray biodiversity offsetting, which we know had a fairly tortuous travel through the previous Secretary of State for the Environment's tenure. It was reputedly kicked into the long grass, but Network Rail are utilising biodiversity offsetting as a possibility to try and look at their network improvements, Crossrail 1, Crossrail 2, Thameslink, etc. So there is other schemes which are beginning to emerge which may provide funding. The question is obviously about being kind of rigorous and making sure that we're not sort of selling our souls to the devil.
Mathew, I was fascinated to your work with housing associations, because one of the big, dare I say, legacy projects that the Avon Wildlife Trust is planning post-2015 is a very big project across Gloucester in the west of England, working with 10 housing associations, having 4 people employed to do nothing but get those communities involved in looking after those green spaces and, in wildlife habitat creation, food growing and so on. So we've got big ambitions in that space. Linking to this morning, it's interesting that the sort of arguments we've been making in that is I happen to know a housing association in a previous life that spent 140,000 a year cutting the grass, and they're a medium-sized housing association in terms of units and so on, not a particularly big one. So, I suppose we've used a mixed argument approach, partly economic, partly healthier, happier communities. We've probably failed on the intrinsic. So how have you approached those discussions with the housing associations, and what else should we be doing in that space of linking social deprivation and nature deprivation?
Right, well, I had the benefit of working for Peabody, which gave me an insight, and the role was actually to improve the open spaces. So I had an insight to not only how Peabody worked, but how other housing associations are structured, what their regulatory regimes are, etc., etc., etc. I had £1 million budget, which is quite useful, big step up from when I was at London Wildlife Trust previously, when I had £5,000 per annum, and the ability to influence new development programmes. But the critical issue for me was about resident satisfaction. The economic argument, given the scheme of the money that Peabody had on an annual basis, open space was peanuts. But resident satisfaction was absolutely crucial to what the board and the senior executives thought about what they were doing. And I could prove by basically getting residents on side, listening to them, finding out what they wanted, the fact that they could improve their space, I could help them improve their space, I could help get funding to improve their space, was the thing that triggered things off, to the point that the chief executive, I heard him talking about how many trees Peabody had, which had never happened before. I think the advantage of working with social landlords is they've got a fairly standard way of working. They have systems in place. And it's about, from a wildlife perspective, it's putting almost the ecological arguments aside and looking at well-being and looking at trying to reduce turnover, which is one of the measures that they're concerned about. So if there's a high turnover of residences in the estate, it's because it's not a nice place to live. That there is a resident engagement, so that the residents are having the confidence to sort of help staff manage the estate as a whole, not just necessarily the open spaces, and the antisocial behaviour rates plummet. And I think that's about working very closely with residents, very closely with estate staff. We spent 3 years working with 8 social landlords on one particular project, which I'll discuss later this afternoon. But it was about particularly having staff who can work with the very tortuous issues of the tenant-landlord relationship, which is fraught with a whole number of issues, and it's about us. We were being brokers, in effect, a neutral party, helping both to achieve a kind of common aim. And I think the first step is the residents generally are quite willing to step in. There are always a few issues. It's the estate staff who may feel challenged in terms of territories which are being encroached upon, and that's something that I could more than happy to sort of talk in more detail to you.
Peter Massini from the Great London Authority again. We're talking about nature-rich cities, and cities by definition are full of people. But you just got to look around this room today to recognise that we as a movement, even after 30 years, we are not representative of people who live in cities. And I just wonder what people have got to comment on that and how we address that issue.
Yes, Birmingham is a majority ethnic place now, and we are, when I go to meetings, the demographic looks very much like this, so we've got a huge challenge. The conversation I was having yesterday was, we're not using the right language, I don't think we've got the messages right, we're not talking to people about valuing nature in the way that is culturally relevant. And we need to do some work, I think, as urban nature conservation groups to look at that and think, well, how do we talk to people in the way that they will engage with? But then the other side of it is, if I look at the map of Birmingham that I was describing, the south of Birmingham is very green, and that's generally a very white area, and the area that I was describing as being very red, i.e. high deprivation, is generally the majority ethnic population area. So there is there's lots of issues in there that we're going to need to unpick if we're going to actually make some real progress in that area.
I mean, as long as I can remember working in the urban environment on urban ecology and nature conservation, we have been finding that the black and ethnic minority groups have not been involved. I think it's changing, and certainly, I mean, a place like Camley Street, it's very much more mixed. I don't know what sort of figures you can give on that, Mathew, but it's in certain situations the local communities have started to take more interest. But I do believe there is still a real problem. But if you talk to Judy Ling Wong, who ran the Black Environment Network for a long time and is still involved with art and the environment projects, she will bring together a very wide spectrum of society in those meetings. It would be, if you had one of her meetings in this room, it would be a totally different mix. And it's interesting, it's been set at a different, the perspective is different, and it encourages people to come from a whole range of different communities. So we do need to think hard about this. Is it something within the nature conservation community that's, causing the problem?
There's much more engagement in allotments generally with a broad range. Certainly that's the case in Birmingham. There's just very little connection between the allotments communities and the urban nature conservation.
Yeah, just a quick word on allotments. The Urban Pollinator Project that ran in a whole bunch of cities around the country, allotments are one of the top places for pollinators in British cities. So there's a bit of a wildlife, there's an increasing wildlife link there. It's good for your veggies, good for well-being, and good for pollinators.
I'm a resident of Bristol. My name is Carol Littlewell. I'm not from any other group or organisation, and I just would like to give you a little story of our street, which is a terrace. No front gardens, and to illustrate that city's made up of people and what can be done. We basically, that street was very bare and barren, and it's now absolutely flourishing. Of 53 houses, 78 of them have got hanging baskets, window boxes. It's green. And at the end of the street, there was a piece of land that was a bomb site, which has now been made into a most beautiful garden with a barbecue area and a picnic bench. And those families that had no gardens now go out there, have their breakfast. Children love being in this garden. It's an absolute haven of peace and intergenerational. We've got a group of young mums and babies that meet in the garden when they can, and a group of older residents like myself who are now the grands, and we work together with them and the children. We put in for the Kew Gardens, the Grow Wild grant, and put in an application which was chaired by an 11-year-old. So we've got young children very involved, babies, mums, and older people. And I just thought to let professionals know that there are just ordinary residents batting away, increasing the ecological awareness and love of beauty and nature in the society.
Yeah.
My point carries on from that, and it's slightly the reverse. So I live in a multicultural part of Bristol. When I was on maternity leave, I got some funding from the council and turned a bomb site on the end of my street with the residents on the street into a community garden, and it's been flourishing for 7 years. It's lovely. But around that, the area that I live in is gentrifying, and the mixed multicultural area that I actively wanted to live in is now changing and becoming very white and middle class and gentrified. And the school that my children go to, the intake is suddenly very much more white and middle class, because the school's been very involved in gardening and taking the kids out and forest school and all these things that white middle class families seeking good education experiences for their children find very important. But as a result of that, the community that I live in is being massively changed, and that diversity that you're just talking about trying to reach, that's all, it's not being included, it's being pushed out. House prices rising, the heart of that community is being massively changed, partly as a result of nature coming into that area of the city. So I think it's a real challenge to enable people to take hold of that. These diverse communities, who are they? What does it mean to them? Actually, are they bothered? They're not that bothered if they could be pushed out of where they have been living and where they've been building their communities for years and years. And I think that's a challenge, really, that we've got to look
Does
at.
one person on the panel want to pick up that challenge?
I think it's something that we as an organisation struggle with. Because I think even the two projects that I was referring to, Woodbury Down and also West Hendon Estate, we are a nature conservation organisation. Yes, we are concerned about environmental injustice. Should we be engaged in projects which are possibly going to be resulting in social exclusion, as new developments basically encourage the idea of an affordable home starting at $450,000? This is something which London is changing at an unbelievable rate, and so are other cities in Britain. And we need to, I think, as a sector, need to ask ourselves, I think going back to Peter's point about who do we represent, need to be thinking much deeper about what that is and the implications of our activities. They may be well intended, I'm sure we all are trying to do the right thing for nature, but also they're for cities as well. And I think there is possibly a need for some discussion about this to work with a much broader range of organisations. I think we do quite well, but we could do so much better, as George has mentioned, but also to, I suppose, in some ways embed our roots much more deeper in communities. We have a project, very, very quickly, Jane, where we've been trying to reach out to people who want to work in the sector but haven't been through tertiary education. I mean, if you look at nature conservation jobs now, you need a primary degree, you need a secondary degree, you need to have worked voluntarily for 8 years and become an intern before you even get looked at. That cannot go on. So we're working with people who have not gone through tertiary education. They've left school maybe at 16, and we're giving them the skills to work on land, in working identification, on planning issues, and we need to do that much more open and kind of a rigid approach, I think, because I think we're in danger of missing a trick.
Yeah. Okay. I'd like to end by. I want you all to end on the thought of the bomb street, the bomb bit at the end of the street, with the grandmas and the children and everyone playing together and the bees buzzing in the undergrowth and so on. Something that's good for people and good for wildlife. And I'd like to thank our panellists for superb talks and lots of questions from the audience.